public cloud services at NetApp, where I do a lot of work with Azure. I do a lot of work with Azure today, but I've worked with all of our cloud solutions. I've actually been part of the cloud team for about 7 years now. Seems like it was yesterday, but we've been running like crazy. Yeah, I joined NetApp 12 years ago next month. So I actually worked on the product side and introduced the technology that became our first cloud solution inside of the public cloud environments. And this was currently known today as Cloud Volumes ONTAP. But I introduced that at the very start of 2009 in NetApp, and basically taking that technology, virtual machine-based solution, and starting to develop that into real products. So been doing this for quite a while, and then the cloud side has been on different angles there with Azure, with Amazon, with Google, so a lot of the sides there. But today I want to talk specifically about the enterprise app, and when we're talking about evolution, so I'm going to talk about the evolution, and I'll get into a little bit of a demonstration here towards the end. But from an evolution perspective, I'll start with the basics, simple, everybody understands. Everything was in the data center. From the app side of things, all the core applications have been in the data center. And as the cloud came about, and 10-ish years ago, but really started to ramp up after that, there was a lot of flexibility there. But when we're talking about enterprise apps, one of the big challenges was, is this something that moves, right? We've seen a lot of people start off with, hey, I'm going to do a data backup, or I might even go so far as a disaster recovery. But in the middle there is that heavy development activity where we've seen, but over the last couple of years, there's been a big push to get more of those core enterprise applications moved over to the cloud, whether it's just the current applications or different types of solutions there. Think Oracle, think SQL, think SAP. These big environments that are core critical environments for a customer's environment, making those move over into the cloud. But really there's been questions or challenges or concerns that people have expressed as this starts to happen. And it really comes around, a big one is around performance, making sure that you get the performance out of an environment in the cloud that you've built to satisfy the need of the business. And then there's security, and we know a lot of the migration to cloud concerns. Security is always a big one of those. And then availability. Hey, as this thing goes down, what are my consequences? So what a lot of these things are, when you're making this move into the cloud, you're doing it for the agility side of things, or these flexibility pieces, or maybe it's cost. You want to take your environment and pay for it when you need it. You want to dial up, dial down. You get all these flexibility pieces, but really need to address that concern of what happens when there's a hiccup. There's always a hiccup somewhere. The key is how do you address it, and how do you minimize the impact on business? And when we're talking about this migration path, it really comes down to, what are you wanting to do? And we see basically 4 key directions that people move, whether it's just rehost, the lift and shift model. Just take what you've got in the data center, throw it over the fence, and get that running in the cloud. And then the next one is the refactor. Make some tweaks, and I actually even think there's a couple in between there that clean up, do some different stuff to make your environment more efficient and more adapt to the cloud-based environment. Then you come into the right 2 is where you re-architect or even rebuild. And customers that we've talked to in the past, this is always one of the big challenges, especially in the enterprise app environment, where you've got typically applications that are built by somebody else that may not be designed specifically to run in the cloud. So if you're taking an application environment and moving that, you're effectively moving the infrastructure piece of it off your data center, moving that into the cloud, and then you've got your expectations when you do that. So can you rebuild it? Can you re-architect it? Or do you need to live in the rehost, the refactor side of things as you make that migration? So a lot of the times that we see here is on these first 2 steps, when it comes to the enterprise apps, taking advantage of what's already built, but then blending it into the flexibility of the cloud, and really from that infrastructure perspective. So I want to ask a question for you guys. What percentage of enterprise apps do you think, or maybe require files?
All of them?
All of them?
Yeah, I'm going 90%.
Okay, you guys are way up there.
I'm with Chris, all of them.
Yeah,
All
I
of
was going to say it depends on who you ask, right? I mean, obviously you asked us, but who are our people that we ask?
And it
Yeah,
also
exactly.
depends on what you mean by require files.
Right. It's like DR. Everything is under control. So.
All right, I set that one up loosely for you. No, but files, so there's a couple things here. When we're talking about an enterprise workload, right now we see 65% of those that are still relying on the on-premise infrastructure or the deployment locations for the applications. But on the file side of it, it comes down to about half. Around 45% have a reliance on a file system in order to do that. I would probably think, like you guys were saying, from an argue standpoint, there's a little bit of this and a little bit of that may be a file-based here and there. And I think about 4 years ago when I did my first AWS reInvent, one of the questions that came, even guys that were building completely from scratch in the cloud first model, everything, still were coming to us saying, hey, can you help me out? I got a few log files, or I got a few different file environments. And it's one of those where I looked at what was being built at the time was block and object. You know, object being the new greatest thing under the sun. Everybody thought that object would solve all the needs of the file environment themselves. One of the big pieces there came into what were the enterprise environments really searching for? Performance was one of the big ones. We're talking about object. You're not getting the deterministic response times that you had expected when you're actually deploying some of these environments. And depending on the environment, you know, that may need to be very low latency, or you got high throughput requirements. You know, some of those things that were needed in the file environments and the providers just didn't have a solution for. And a lot of the customers that we worked with were looking for a better solution than going out and building their own NFS server, you know, building their own file server on compute nodes, you know, just to solve that challenge of, hey, I've got these files, I need to dump them somewhere, and then I got to get a Samba server and set it up and connect into the Windows side of it. But you're basically trying to create your own environment. But the issue is you're going to the cloud for a lot of times just for the ease, right? You're going there because you want this flexibility. You want a service level model that's easy to say, I just need some capacity, I need it at a certain level, and I need to run with it. But then it's, I got to go build a file server in order to support this infrastructure. So since then, each of the providers have came out with a given solution depending on what they were trying to solve for, whether it's NFS or Windows environments. But performance is one that still has lagged. And that's one of those where we're seeing a lot of customers saying, hey, we see the performance in the data center. Why do I have to subject my my environments to a low-performing solution when I make that move into the cloud? And then reliability is another one. And when I say reliability, I'm talking availability. And there's a little more to it, but effectively, when I have my data, I want to be sure that it's there and it's always accessible. And I don't have to deal with something hiccuped, oh, but you'll get it back in a minute. But I need to make sure that my application, which is expecting that data to be there at any given moment, is there. And so dealing with that availability scenario, and then bringing in the management capabilities. Again, block environments, some of a lot of the storage environments in the cloud really are infrastructure, right? It's treated as a volume, it's treated as a block environment, whatever it is, but it's very limited in what you get out of it. Again, if I'm moving an application that relies on these items in the data center, why do I have to regress when I make that move? And one of the big things that we see here is, you know, if you think of an application architecture, there's three key knobs: compute, storage, and network. I think in the cloud, one of the big things is network is not even a concern. You don't even need to think about network performance unless you're talking site to site or on-prem to the cloud itself. I mean, then you're dealing with those scenarios. But when you're talking about within the environment, it's very high-speed backplanes. Compute, the environments have hundreds of different compute options, and you can choose, you can dial up to a very high dollar compute depending on what your need is. You know, think SAP environments that require massive memory inside of the data environment or inside of the compute environment. You know, you can dial up and dial down whatever you need, and you have kind of access to some of the latest and greatest from each of the compute providers. But storage was typically the bottleneck. And so living with or limiting the performance of an environment really took that whole architecture and brought it down a notch. It's like, how do I make up for the performance that I need when I don't have the performance out of the storage layer? So I'll just kind of bounce through this. There's a couple different scenarios for migrating apps in there. What we see a lot of is the DevOps environments, web apps, databases, databases becoming very popular and moving in. I think as Oracle and SAP have been doing more support for the platforms themselves instead of doing their own thing, they're actually starting to see a lot of customers move those database environments over. And then SAP as well. SAP kind of as a multi-level solution, whether it's an enterprise app and a database at the same time, as the current drive is. And I'll get into these ones specifically. Let me jump ahead real quick here. So one of the things that we worked with Microsoft on about 3 years ago, we started development on one of the key challenges that they were running into in this space, which was they needed an NFS environment. First of all, they had to solve for any application that was Linux-based or had a Linux file system requirement. They needed that. And so they came to us and we actually worked closely together on building a service for Microsoft. So this is not a NetApp service. This is, you'll see Azure NetApp Files is the name. NetApp is in the name, but the point is this is a Microsoft service. And they came to us and we worked together on building this service out as a native solution for Microsoft. And as we rolled this out from an NFS or a Linux perspective, we also, most of our customers had already known that we serve both Windows as well as Linux environments. So we integrated that in, moved in, did multiple protocols across the solution. We just rolled out a dual volume or dual protocol support per volume. So if anybody wants to deploy something in the cloud, they can actually run the application, which is Linux-based. They could have their clients accessing it with a Windows machine. They don't actually have to set up multiple environments and keep the data in sync between both of those.
Yeah, I have a question. I mean, I checked on the documentation, and Azure NetApp Files is different from NetApp Files that you provide on other service provider. I mean, the service is similar, but all the limitations or the constraints that are on AWS, for example, aren't here. I mean, the size of the volume and the number of, there are, some constraints. Why this difference?
So basically when we look at, I'm talking about Azure NetApp Files here, but think of it as the broader, we have a solution to address the service-based deployment model for Azure, AWS, and Google, as you mentioned. And some of the things here is that AWS is effectively a NetApp solution. Right? This is a NetApp solution that we provide on with AWS through the marketplace platform and some of the extensions of the marketplace so that we can do a hosted environment inside of AWS. And then we did the same for Google, and Google was a little bit different in that everything in the Google environment follows the Google look and feel. It's not like a marketplace offering, so there are some differences that are required because of that. And then as we make the step to Azure NetApp Files, as I mentioned, this is an Azure service. So with it being an Azure service, there are requirements that Microsoft had for their environment. And we sit inside the data center. We have dedicated dedicated network connections directly into the compute infrastructure, for performance and these different capabilities. But from an architecture standpoint, each of them is architected a little bit different. And it actually, some of the effect are some of those different limitations, or I won't even say maybe limitations, but configuration settings, what's allowable from a limit standpoint and those different things. And that's based on how they're architected with each of the providers.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, more or less, yes.
So let me throw one thing in real quick just for clarity. Is your target audience, is it kind of that legacy, I don't want to use legacy, but I'm going to go ahead and use it as just, it is what it is. Legacy environments that want to move to the cloud. So you've got your typical enterprise we're used to doing things this way and all that. We want to provide that functionality in the cloud to get them there. And then that's that next jump off point to where they go to more cloud native and things like that. Or am I completely off base here?
So I got two ways to answer that one. So
Sure.
I would say yes and yes. One of the big things that we see is this whole, the whole industry migrating environments into the cloud.
Right.
Whether it's as simple as I need to get a percentage of my environment, my data center moved out. I need to hit some targets in that, maybe it's an OpEx requirement that they have. All the way up to, we have a number of customers that are going through full data center evacuations, right?
Okay.
They are moving out wholesale. So it's a huge requirement is we need to be able to support all of that that's moving. But then on the other hand, there's those that are doing cloud native, right? They're building things from scratch. And through that, kind of as I guess as you guys almost highlighted, is there's file requirements in most of these scenarios, even if it is fully designed that way. It's probably a different architecture at that point. Maybe it won't have as much reliance on the file infrastructure. So we are also solving that with different solutions within NetApp, right? So we've got Kubernetes solutions and different environments to help more address that side of the market.
Okay. And I just wanted to make sure that I was clear as we roll forward, is because, this does look and feel like traditional enterprise, which I think is exactly where you're going with this. But when I start thinking about from a cloud native architectural design, I don't care about this, right? To some degree. So
to some degree, that's the case. It really comes down to a file requirement.
Nope,
and
good. We're good. We're good. Thanks.
One of the things too here though is that there is a little bit of an in-between in that by delivering a service that takes away, I think one of the big things that we shot for with this is I don't need to be a guru on storage to try to get storage deployed. And it was something that we ran into in a number of cases in past where it's a cloud architect that we're dealing with that's trying to deploy a new capability or deal with the requirements that are coming across as these items migrate. They don't know enough about storage to have all the bells and whistles and knobs and turns to make this successful. So it was really about trying to create an environment that was very simple to use and to the point that even the application teams could deploy their own capacity as needed. Obviously, as that scale grows, then that starts to change. You need somebody to manage all your data. But effectively, we definitely are trying to solve for those needs of the customers that are not quite just the storage experts when making that move into the cloud. So just to jump ahead, really one of the things that we wanted to do here was bring some of those capabilities. Just the simple things like snapshots and cloning and setting up storage level replication. Being able to do some of these things, again, that people, kind of to your question, was they've experienced this stuff. They know how to protect their data. They want some of these knobs. So we focused on some of the key ones there is to get when we move the service, when we move the data in there, that they have the ability to replicate and they have the ability to do backups of their data sets, but doing it all with an Azure consistent experience or a Google consistent experience and AWS as well. So depending on which platform. One of the things that, I'm going to use the Azure story throughout this, but effectively it's really dealing with the data and the application environments wherever they so choose to deploy. If they want to keep it in the data center, then they're going to keep it in the data center, and that's fine with us. If they want to move to any of the providers, then that's fine with us as well. We want to provide a solution for them. So really, what's the challenge, right? When organizations are looking at transitioning these enterprise applications, these workloads that have file requirements or taking advantage of file requirements, and I'll explain in the SAP example down through this, specifically where this really comes into play from a core standpoint of the data, like the production side of the data, but without having to refactor and re-architect, really trying to bring that risk level down as they bring this up. And if you have to re-architect some of these things, then there's a time and there's a dollar amount associated with that frankly we're struggling to see a lot of customers taking those core enterprise apps and trying to go into that redesign model. Some of the areas that we really focused on this were around some of the key challenges when you're making the move in. Reducing risk, making sure that achieving 99%, 99 or 4 nines of availability guaranteed by Microsoft, getting that up there. A lot of the architectures that are done in the cloud target a 395 model for the application environment, and anything that's above that is a positive, anything that's below that is a negative on their calculation of their entire application infrastructure. And with this, we've got the guarantee at 4 nines. So it's a very important one there. And then also we have these built-in data protection capabilities to really help address, if a site goes down. If something happens in a given region in the cloud, you can do replication to other locations or just have multiple backup copies. Whatever your level of protection is, making sure that we solve for that. Addressing the cost standpoint, when you take away a bottleneck, you often reduce the overall cost of the implementation because people are not trying to overcompensate one limitation by cranking up one that's like over-provisioning a setup environment. And then getting that down to the point where having the data set ultra-flexible. You can dial up and dial down performance instantly. And that's a big one. If you know your application's performance profile with it, whether it is throughout the day, if you've got 8 a.m. as a big spike and 4 p.m. as a big spike, you can actually script and set up your performance of your storage to adjust for that. So that if you know for an hour you can dial up the performance to 4 times the level on the storage side, you can do so and dial it right back down afterwards. And getting this adjustments allows you to effectively not spend as much on storage. If you need a high level of performance, you only need it when you need it. So being able to get these adjustments, dial it up and down, and without having to move data, right? It's a big one there. Yes.
Do you do this with a sort of quality of service on your systems? So that, data is still there, but actually it's you're throttling the performance somehow, or is there any other caching or whatever mechanism?
There's 2 aspects of it. One of them, we offer 3 performance tiers that are kind of the general QoS throttling models, so that we can get more into a given environment by adjusting for performance, lower cost environment. So you can basically say, I want a standard tier that gives me 16 megabytes of throughput per second per provision terabyte. And then we have the fastest tier is 128 megabytes per second per provision terabyte. So when I say that,
I can dial, the performance by the hour. So if I'm buying
so you can
terabyte, how can I manage for 1 hour to have 100 terabyte? Whatever it is.
Exactly. Fastest. Yeah, and that's where when I say per terabyte, when if you deploy a terabyte, you get 16 megs of throughput. In the standard, you get 128 megs if you deploy a terabyte. But if you want to dial that up, you can over-provision your capacity. We've seen over 4.5 gigabytes per second of throughput by dialing up the capacity to a large amount for a short period of time. Obviously you're going to pay, but you're only going to pay for that short period of time.
So you over-provision capacity to get better performance. This is
there you go. Yep.
Okay, so it's not really a QoS.
That's the second piece. QoS is you can choose a performance tier and you can switch on the fly for the performance tiers. But then what we see a lot of times is people choose a performance tier that they want that will meet their needs, and then they dial up the capacity and dial down the capacity as needed, which is really QoS on their own standpoint, right? It's a manual QoS at that point.
But sorry, if I have already, 100 terabyte, and I need to double my performance, I have to, to dial up to 200 terabyte, for example. And maybe I reach the limits of the volume, and anyway, it's very expensive, even if it's for a few hours.
So that's where you would say if you're at ultra tier, so there's 3 tiers, standard, premium, and ultra. If you're at ultra, you're at 16 megabytes per second if you have 100 terabytes. And then you have a small amount of data, whatever it is, and then you want to dial that up, you could go to premium and you will get 64 megabytes per second of throughput just from flipping from standard to premium. But you could also do it
on the fly, just for 1 hour.
Yes, just for 1 hour. Yeah, there is a hesitation on the turn back down by setting that up. We don't flip immediately on the turn down, and that's why we see a lot of the customers that are doing it with capacity dialing, because you can effectively double your capacity and effectively double your performance and then dial it back down immediately. So there are two knobs to turn to make that happen. So what I wanted to jump into here is when we're talking about migrating environments, some of the struggles from the customers we've seen is that effectively a lot of these high performance environments or core business environments are unmigratable. And this is kind of terminology that we and Microsoft have both heard in this scenario, where they're not getting what they need. They're trying to make a move into the environment, and the capacity, or sorry, the performance of the environment just isn't solving the challenge. So I'll run through a couple of these scenarios. This is actually Microsoft's look from an application standpoint, very focused on the migration activities. Windows apps, SQL servers, Linux apps, databases, and SAP. They actually have a very specific focus on SAP, as do we. But then also beyond that, there's also the specialized workloads. And this is high performance computing, arguably not an enterprise app, but if you ask the guys that are running it, it is a core enterprise environment to their business relies upon. And then VDI, and I'm not going to dive into VDI. I'm going to let Mike and Chuck talk about that one as we get to the second hour. But effectively, the different environments and how VDI has become a key component of an enterprise architecture. So looking at some of the applications, you know, we talked about the file environments, right? So at a base level, it's delivering file services for both Linux and for Windows, and doing it with enterprise capabilities. So when we're talking about making it very simple as one of those key service level architectures that we did, and then delivering performance. On-prem like performance, we've actually it's a couple slides away, but we got customers that are seeing better performance in this environment than they were seeing in the data center prior to the environment moving to the cloud. But yet being able to deliver full automation capabilities with the APIs and CLIs for the environment, getting instant snapshot and restore capabilities, as well as cloning capabilities brought into the environment as well. The cloning being a very big one for the dev environments, where you can actually clone production data sets instantly and quickly get workspaces spun up. But then just the snapshot, you know, giving a backup or a local copy or a local recovery point in case something does happen, and being able to restore that quickly. Two key components. Snapshot technology is something that is blah, you know, everybody does it. But one of the key things that when we make the move into the cloud is the architecture that we developed with snapshots it's a zero footprint architecture, right? We basically lock space, and then so we don't actually do a copy type snapshot. In the cloud, you pay for every penny. You know, it's not an over provisioned environment or under provisioned environment. You pay for every penny that you have there. So anytime you take a snapshot, first of all, if it's done extremely fast, you lower your local backup times, but then also you don't take any footprint. So you're not actually adding cost to your environment by taking a snapshot. So if you only could afford to do one snapshot a day based on the previous architectures, you know, you now have, you know, the zero footprint option to maybe it's 4, maybe it's 10. You can take a lot of snapshots and not impact your windows and not your backup windows, and not impact your cost footprint in the cloud environment. So it's just something simple that when you take and you rebuild into a different environment, you know, it really has a significant impact. And then being able to replicate, you know, being able to set up and say, I've got a failure domain, a disaster recovery site. Maybe if it's a US, it's West Coast, East Coast. You know, maybe it's Europe. We have multiple regions that are supported in each of the key Azure regions. So maybe it's Germany. You've got 2 data centers there. You want disaster protection. Being able to do that replication. We just rolled that out into a public preview back 2 months, almost 2 months ago. So that's something that's out there for customers to utilize as well. So bringing in those things that they've come to expect in the data center, now being able to do them when they move into the cloud.
I have a question.
Sure.
The cross-region replication, is that based on SnapMirror or is that something else?
So based on is probably the best way to put it. It's really a separate replication architecture. One of the things is when you're operating in a cloud environment, this is heavily multi-tenant. And the SnapMirror architecture requires a level of control of the storage environment that doesn't play into this widely distributed multi-tenant environment. So we modified how things are utilized so that we can do cross-region replication and do, if there's 30 customers on effectively, under the covers on a given machine, they don't have to know too much about the machine environment in order to do it. So one of the areas that we've really started dialing up or getting a dialed interest in from our customers is the Oracle space. One of the big ones with this, we have a couple of customers that have, we're actually working on a couple public references we'll have out for everybody to take a look at very soon. But they've actually moved their database environment in there. And as I talked about a little earlier, one of the struggles that they've ran into is the performance of the storage is just not beneficial to their environment, whether it's throughput or latency response to the actual data environment. Being able to put a data store in Azure NetApp Files versus some other ways, whether it's some of the block environments or some of the other environments they could choose from, they've been able to see, they were seeing anywhere from 3 to 7 milliseconds of latency to address their response time when they're accessing data out of the database. And then with Azure NetApp Files, they're seen as in the neighborhood of a half a millisecond of latency. So when we're talking about substantial response time differences, anywhere from 3 to 10 or more times or less time to respond in the environment. And it really opened the door for the customers to say, you know what? We were really over provisioning our compute in order to address and get the best performance that we could out of the environment because we were effectively being throttled by the storage. So when they put Azure NetApp Files under the covers, that low latency response times really ramped up their performance and allowed them to dial back their compute infrastructure. They were able to bring that down to a lower level. And that's just, we're talking on the given instance types. And then it opens the doors too for, do they have a multi-compute node architecture where they're paying for Oracle licenses on every single one of these? Can they dial that down to a point where they may not need some of the compute or the virtual machines themselves? So there's a bunch of angles that they started seeing some significant cost savings, again, because they broke the bottleneck, right? They opened up for the entire architecture to be more efficient. And this one is, as we're talking about data and log files, this is where we're seeing customers using the higher performance tiers of the storage so they can get the response time and the throughput to be able to address all of that stuff flowing as fast as possible. And then as you move off into some of the shared, some of the binary files in these environments for the architecture, they're able to dial that down and utilize some lower performing service levels. So something that really opened the door for them. And then one of the big ones was around the backup side of this. So when we have this integrated snapshot technology into the environment, what they were seeing, oops, where'd that slide go? Oh, maybe it's here. So they actually saw a 60x boost in performance for their backup windows when they're actually backing up their databases themselves. And it was one where the customer was utilizing this for their development environments because of the time and the slow aspect of the actual backups. It was taking them 15 hours to do a backup of a database environment, and they were actually just taking a snapshot and the cleanup and the extra activities that go on there. They dropped it down to 15 minutes. So no data being replicated in that scenario. You're talking local backups of the data set, but 60x reduction was a substantial impact on them and allowed them to do more frequent more frequent backups, so they had tighter recovery points and everything. So something that was very big in that environment, and we're seeing that more and more across customers as they start to look at Oracle migrations into Azure. I mentioned SQL there as well. SQL is an environment as well that we support, but the one big thing is it's a database. That's really the same story between Oracle and SQL, except for some of the name changes under the covers, but effectively a very similar story there. One thing I wanted to highlight here, and I'm just going to breeze through this one, is high performance computing environment. Again, not really an enterprise application, but our customer Repsol, I actually just spoke to them right before we got on this discussion, but they actually were migrating a lot of their information over for their very specific application, but required a lot of throughput, a lot of data response time. They actually were able to get 5x, I think it's in their quote here, but they were able to get 5x the performance utilizing an Azure NetApp Files storage backend in the cloud, not over what else they were trying to do in the cloud, but over their own data center. So the environment, the faster access, or the access to the faster compute nodes, the access to the fast storage environment really allowed them to scale their capabilities over what they were doing in the data center. Yes?
I don't want to be rude here, but actually we don't know what kind of storage system did they have on their premises, because if they have, you know, an hard disk drive based system from 5-7 years ago, and now they are going on an all flash, you know, Azure cloud, whatever 5 system. I mean, of course it's 5. I mean, 5x is very small actually. So my problem is, are we comparing apple with oranges here? Because you know, they are going faster. You know, if you are comparing all flash on premises with the same kind of hardware and on the cloud, then okay, 5x is, you know, astonishing. But if you are comparing something that they had on premises, and you know, maybe it was old and everything, I mean, hard disk based, old generation, whatever, with the latest technology that you have on the cloud, of course it's 5x.
Yes, I will say absolutely. And not trying to hide that fact. That's actually one of my caveats at the end. You're absolutely right that it really is architecture dependent, but it's one of the big things here is the ability to move the environment over and still get on-premises like performance. You know, so if you're talking about they just bought the latest and greatest system and they're trying to get the maximum performance possible out of that, they are going to see a little bit of variation just because of the abstracted architecture of a cloud environment. But effectively, what they were seeing there is a substantial boost. They have a lot of compute requirement is there as well, because a lot of that piece of it requires was heavy on compute infrastructure. So there's multiple angles of this. So I'm not even going to pretend like it's faster than the latest and greatest in the cloud. But the thing is, it's in the neighborhood. And that was the important one for them as they made that move into the cloud architecture.
And you meant neighborhood, meaning I moved to the cloud, right?
I'm sorry, say that again.
I said you meant it's in the neighborhood because I'm now in the cloud. Check that box off. It actually, so yeah, it's in the neighborhood. I'm in the cloud. I got that box checked. Yeah, exactly. One of the things they saw in their first architecture, they did testing in the environment, and they saw a 10x performance drop when they started testing in the cloud. So one of the big things was by comparative, what they were going to be able to do, they killed the project basically because they couldn't get the performance in the cloud that was even reasonably close to what the data center looked like. So when they were able to run this on an environment that is built on the latest technology in the cloud, it did open that and completely flip the performance metrics. But yes, it's all dependent too. So I wanted to jump into SAP, as I think this one is a really good example of an enterprise app, and from one of the core standpoints of, I don't know a customer that uses SAP that isn't a critical component of their architecture. You know, you're paying for a key system like this that
or solution like this, then it's a key component. But we do see a lot of migration. I actually have some information. I didn't put it in here, but some comparisons. We're just about to roll out a video with IDC on some of the things that they've seen in this environment as well. But this is the only file storage service in the cloud that is certified for use with SAP HANA. One of the big things is, and I'll explain why files matter in this context, but files add delay, right? When you're talking about trying to access a file system, it adds delay to the environment. And when you're using with SAP HANA, there is the KPIs associated with that. You have to hit sub-millisecond response times, period, or you can't be certified. And there isn't a file service out there that can do that until Azure NetApp Files, and by note down below here is the Cloud Volume Service environment for GCP as well. But that's a big one in that it really changes the way the architecture is able to be deployed in a cloud environment. And I'll jump into that one in a moment. But there's basic file shares, right? There's just some of your binary environments, or some of this you can do on the lower tiers of the file service environment, but then being able to dial all the way up to the data and the log infrastructure as well, which is the key component for being able to deploy production databases in Azure. And then usually, we've seen it with our customers already, is just having the data meet the performance requirements is not enough. So being able to bring in some of those capabilities and features and functions is key. So being able to back up and have an integrated backup that quiesces the database, before backups happen, so you don't have to, you basically scramble your data if you don't do that. So being able to do some of these things that are integrated into the application architecture is key. And I did this slide here, let's see, to really walk through what this means from an architecture standpoint. If you look off to the left here, that there's a scale-up capability within Azure. There's a lot of different compute nodes. They're always investigating and trying to come up with higher level of compute with memory capabilities, but you can scale up to 6 terabyte databases in that environment. But what file service, oops, wrong button. There we go. But what a file service brings to you is the ability now to scale out. And when you have a shared data environment, you can scale out that data set because it's production certified, and you can scale it out. Number one is number two in this one is you get the scale out. You can now go to a 12 terabyte database with multi-node support here. But then number three, you can scale out and you can do a standby node. Standby node is a big one because we're talking about the risk profile significantly changes here, because now you can say, all right, I'll do a 2-node with a standby, and in case I ever lose a node, or if I lose a compute, I can quickly recover to the one sitting there in standby. Big deal from a cost perspective as well, but mainly this is about a risk to the environment. Nobody does this in the cloud today. And this really opens that door up. I think other providers and actually even Microsoft has done a hardware-based dedicated environment to solve the larger scale applications or HANA applications in their environment. And this now allows them to go and utilize a common Azure infrastructure for doing this. But then being able to scale out up to a 15-node plus a standby by giving up to 96 terabyte databases into this environment. So we already have one customer that's already doing very large databases in this environment that's already using this infrastructure for doing that. But being able to take that and say, all right, now I can fail over if I have a node happen. One of our customers, I think their number is roughly $23 billion worth of transactions go through their environment every year. It's critical. It's very expensive for them to lose anything. So being able to fail over quickly, but then being able to have an integrated backup capability into there, and I'll touch on this in the next couple of slides, but taking snapshots, having recovery points more regularly and being able to do them quickly and do them efficiently. And then taking into the replication side of it, being able to replicate to a second data center so you have DR capabilities. And the note here is really looking at, we're talking about the VMs. You build your infrastructure and you shut down the VMs. And these are not cheap VMs. The large scale memory virtual machines within any of the cloud providers are probably the most expensive ones that they have access to. So in an environment, when you have production and you're doing the replication at the storage layer, you've now got a recovery point that you can take advantage of without having to build a complete architecture and run it all the time. And when you have a secondary copy of data, now that opens up additional layers for projects and development landscapes, those types of things when you're actually making that move into the DR side without being any impact on your primary data set. And then one of the big things that, you know, IDC has determined from their investigations is analytics is a big driver as to why people are utilizing the cloud. That's probably no news to you guys, but really being able to take advantage of those extra functions, those extra capabilities now that you have your data set, your database environments in the cloud. But this is really kind of a folding story that goes through each of the different aspects of what we brought into the architecture and how that plays into a complete architecture, a production, backup, DR architecture in the cloud itself. And when I talk about some of the backup stuff, I mean, we're talking about we did some work with a customer on a 2.3 terabyte database. Relatively small, but doing a file-based backup in this environment took 2 hours and 40 minutes. When they were actually able to take a snapshot backup integrated, 2 minutes and 11 seconds. So significant differences when you're actually doing a storage layer backup at the snapshot level instead of doing file-based backups, which is what was being done before. Big number from how much reduction you get. So when you're talking about how often you can back up, this really has a direct impact on that. And then, go ahead.
You're able to configure those backups so they're immutable. So insider attack or something like that, someone doesn't just go and clear the snapshots, you've lost your data, whereas obviously backing off to another solution, you could configure those things to stop insider attack.
Yeah, you can do that on the local level. You're going to just get a snapshot copy that is at the storage layer, so there could be an access point there, but you can actually do the replication off to the secondary location, so you can copy the data sets to somewhere else and protect yourself against that. Usually done at a slower pace or a less often pace, but the point is you do have recovery points depending on that one. And I think Chuck will get into that in a couple different scenarios as well in our second hour. Not specific to an SAP scenario, but some of those immutable protections. And you know, if you can back up the data, it's only as good as you can restore it. So being able to do quicker restores on this as well. You know, it took 1 hour and 40 minutes for the customer on what used to take 5.5 hours to recover their data sets. Substantial, allowed them to do, they were doing 4 snapshots at copies per day. Not a lot, but you know, it's one of those when you reduce the time by significant amounts, you open that door for more. And then do full SAP system refreshes. You know, you're talking 3 hours and 20 minutes to 1 hour. So again, taking some of the snapshot-based model versus a file-based backup model, which is what was having to be done in the past, really serves as a significant reduction in the actual time for running these activities.
So I'm seeing this snapshot thing in SAP, and I forgive me, I don't know SAP, but is this anything new? I mean, is this something new, and I'm just not catching why it's important, or it is what it is?
So one of the kind of as I kind of flow through this, and I think it was even touching on your last question, was we're making things available to people in the cloud that they didn't have access to before. In the data center, they tend to expect this.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is a very similar story. The backup piece of it is a very similar story to the same one we tell for the data center.
Okay.
You know, being able to use the integrated stuff, some of our value props are around that. The production environment, currently most everybody in an SAP environment is still running production in the data center. What this has done is opened up the ability,
flexibility and functionality out. Okay, gotcha. Sorry about that, but yeah, I was just like, okay.
I think there's, and this is my personal opinion as I hit my microphone. My personal opinion is that things were built to solve a basic challenge of access to infrastructure in the cloud. But it's it takes time and it takes effort, and you know, what have we spent a lot of our time as NetApp doing over the last 27 years is solving some of these data challenges. And as we move into the cloud environment, it wasn't solved for. You know, it was something that, why is there so much development in the cloud? You know, because there's not really a risk of losing data in that type of a scenario. But as you start to move, or you want to move production into there, you know, build it in yourself, you know, and that's usually the case when you're talking about building a new architecture, going in and completely redesigning an environment. A lot of that protection you have to build it in those scenarios, versus it comes with the platform that you're utilizing. And in this case, we're bringing it with the platform. So being able to do snapshots, being able to do these things are just inherent in the architecture, NetApp architecture that we expose to the audience. So what I'm showing here is, this is the basic interface on the Azure portal. I'm actually going to hide my video. All right, so this is what you see when you log in. I mean, there's some favorites that pop up over there, and you'll see up here in the favorites is Azure NetApp Files. One of the things that, when I'm looking at this environment, typically on a third-party type service, you have to go through the marketplace in order to access these items. And this is, you know, I just like to spell out, I'll probably said it a few times, want to say it 100 times. I never seem to say it enough. All right, and the storage services that are offered by Microsoft, you know, here's all the different environments, just to make sure and point that everybody sees that this is an Azure service itself. This is not a marketplace-based offering from NetApp. And trust me, it's something that I even have Microsoft employees that don't grasp it until you show them. But it's, sorry, that didn't sound right. But it's basically, it's one of those that it's got NetApp in the name. People think it's a NetApp product, but it's really not. So as I go into the Azure NetApp Files environment, we have a couple of key things that we do here. We have what's called a storage account, and this is a Microsoft Azure construct. You have to have an account for all your storage, and it's effectively how you monitor and maintain your storage environment. So I'm part of the tech marketing group, or share environment, or use environment. But in here, we have a couple of different constructs. At the account level is where you go in and set up Active Directory connections, you know, if that's what, if you want to do there. But then you can set up policies. So if you want to set up a snapshot policy, how often do you want to run these? You can just set them up as policy-based. Very straightforward, very clean. Hey, I want to take here's a policy. I want to do an hourly or a daily, and you give it a number of snapshots to keep, and basically just set up a policy-based structure there so that you don't have to, I'm going to back up. Part of my screen is covered. Anyway, so you can actually do these items very simply to get a policy set up for any given type. So whenever you create a volume, you can say, you know what, I want to set it at X policy or Y policy for backups. And then down within here is what's called a capacity pool. And this is effectively a pool of data of like type. So when I say like type, I'm talking service level. I want a premium service level pool. I want a standard pool, or maybe I have an ultra pool. I need really fast performance there. I created one already, but this is really straightforward. I go in here, give it a name, set a service level, and choose the capacity of the pool. Like how many volumes are going to be in that pool. You set up a capacity level for that. I've already created the demo pool here for this one. Look at CFD. And in here, now you have different levels of capabilities. You can look at monitoring capabilities, set tasks in this environment, and then you can go in and start creating volumes. As you can see, I've got 100 gig volume here, but this is where things really we really make it as simple as possible, right? There's not all the difficulty associated with it. It's like, hey, I'm about to go deploy a database, and in that database, I need a volume to support it. I give it a name. I give it, it tells me here how much available space I have in the capacity pool to choose from, or I'd have to go up and up the size of the capacity pool, but that's usually, we can set different administrator access levels that allow you to do some of these or not. And then you set up a volume size. And in this case, the protocol, you come in and you choose your protocol type. Am I using NFS? Am I using SMB? Or is this a dual protocol volume? Give it a name. And in the NFS case, you're choosing NFS v3 or v4, but really just trying to make this very simple. You know, so I'll go back to the basics here. Give it a name, test vol 1, and I'm going to make this a gig, or sorry, a gigabyte, and then I'm going to set it up for, I'll just leave it at NFS v3, and that's it. And you want to set it up, make sure that you've selected all the right criteria, and go create the volume. So very straightforward, simple to use, very easy to deploy. Wow, that one was real quick. That's all dependent on, oh no, deployment is in process. Trying to make it as simple as possible for somebody to have access to their environment. Close this guy. Okay, your volume is created. Oops. Let me jump back in there. I just clicked the wrong X. So I'll jump back in and I'll look at the volumes that I have in the capacity pool. So in the capacity pool, this was my demo environment. Looking at the volumes that are there, there's my 2 volumes, the one I just created, test vol 1. One of the key things that makes this really simple for somebody that's not a storage expert is you go in and you look at the volume itself. You can set up export policies, again, set snapshots at the volume level. One of the big ones, I love this one, is I don't need to worry about the mount details and all the instructions for going in there. I can just go over here and say, all right, jump into my, my machine. Here's my instructions on how to mount this. And based on your policy, your export policies that you set, it'll add in all the details here down at the mount instruction. So it gets it right down to the level of cut, paste, cut, paste, cut, paste, and deploy your volume. And now you're set up to use an NFS volume in this case, but effectively it's trying to make it as simple, try to make it as easy as possible to deploy these. I have some videos as well that show then taking this to the next couple layers. You want to do a database deployment, you want to do a like a backup, you want to do a replication, you want to do that dialing up and down, as we were talking about a little earlier, of the performance levels. I've got a video on showing how to do that in this environment as well. So a lot of different things to really set it up so that it's really easy. I mean, and we try to make it as easy as possible because storage has been known to be rather complex as a whole.